The introduction is, in many ways, one of the most important chapters in a dissertation. My experience suggests that a well-written introduction is usually associated with a well-designed and written dissertation, and this is because it tells how clearly you know what you are doing and why you are doing it, or in other words, you will only be able to write a confined introduction if you have a very clear idea of what you did and what you did not do. The second reason why an introduction is very important is that it captures the interest of the reader. It plays an important role in fulfilling another of the C's, the captivating C. In other words, if you have written a good dissertation, the reader gets a bit excited about reading the rest. And therefore, it's very important that you think carefully about the elements that should go into the introduction and the order in which they should appear. In this video, I'm going to explain the two components of an introduction. And in explaining them and what should feature within each of those components, I'm going to provide examples so that you can understand how they apply in practice. If you're new to the channel, I'm Dr. Miguel Moital, and I am the founder and chief content developer of the Dissertation Academy. So what are the main components of an introduction? The answer to this question is linked to the purpose of a dissertation. So we need to ask the question, what is the purpose of an introduction? There are two purposes, as I said. The first one is what the study is about, and this is what I call the boundaries of the study. And the second one is, why is it important to study what you are wanting to study? And I call this the relevance of the topic. So we have two components, the boundaries of the study and the relevance of the topic. So let's look at what each of these are about. Let's start with the boundaries. Before you can fulfill the confined C, in other words, make sure that the content in your dissertation falls within its objectives, you must clearly define the boundaries or the scope of the study. This requires a clear understanding of both what you are doing and also what you are not doing. Both perspectives are important because they will help you to clearly settle in your mind what your dissertation is about. There are two types of boundaries, and I call them theoretical boundaries and context boundaries. And in short, these are process, content, and context, as explained in the video about the 3 pillars of research. And if you haven't watched the video, consider doing so that you can understand this one better. The link is in the description below. In the end, if you have applied the 3 pillars framework well in your dissertation, it should be easy for you to clearly establish the boundaries of the study in the introduction. Time to look at examples to see how these boundaries work in practice. Let's look at the theoretical boundaries first. And in theoretical boundaries, we are aiming to define both process and content boundaries. Let's look at an example to see how this applies in practice. So what you have here is a dissertation on the barriers and facilitators to event greening practices within the corporate sphere. And this is actually the first paragraph of the dissertation. And the student starts straight away with defining what research is about. This research focuses on the barriers and facilitators to greening within the corporate events industry. And then the student moved on to define critical elements in this statement. And these critical elements are barrier and facilitator. The student provides definitions of these two elements of the title. And interestingly, the student did very well in her dissertation, and partially because she grabbed these definitions from the outset. As I said, this was the first paragraph in the dissertation, and she used these definitions throughout the research. Time to move to the context boundaries. And the example comes from the dissertation, a critical exploration of customer engagement with, it was a specific festival whose name is withdrawn, social networking pages. And the student clearly defines the context as Facebook and Twitter. And then the second part is about why the student chose Facebook and Twitter, which is about the relevance of the study, why it is relevant to study this particular context, in this instance, Facebook and Twitter. So again, Facebook and Twitter are the context, or one of the contexts of the research, in this instance, a product category, and the student makes that clear from the outset. In summary, we have two types of boundaries: theoretical boundaries, which refer to process and content, and context boundaries. Time to move on to the second component, the second purpose of an introduction, which is the relevance. And the relevance is basically why you are doing what you are doing. And here we have three ways of providing reasons for our choice of theoretical boundaries and context boundaries. And they are theoretical reasons, practical reasons, or personal reasons. Let's start with the theoretical reasons. The theoretical reasons are basically the relevance for theory development. What is the expected benefit for theory development if we look at what we want to look at? And from this perspective, it means that there must be some expected development at the process level. So we will be able to understand some sort of process or expand our knowledge about certain content if we carry out the research. When you explain the theoretical relevance, you are bound to pick some ideas contained in the literature review. That's not a problem. Sometimes there's a little bit of repetition between the things that you say in the introduction and some of the things you say in the literature review. That is not a problem at all. In fact, what you're doing is highlighting throughout the dissertation certain key ideas that are important in your research. So don't fear going to the literature review and picking up some of the ideas that you mentioned there, and also include them in the introduction. Let's look at an example, and we have as an example a paragraph from Dissertation on Emotion Regulation Strategies for Managing FOMO-Induced Regret Across Event Constraints. And the student did extremely well, and she was very good at making the academic, the theoretical case for the research. And she uses expressions like an understanding of how event participants negotiate constraints is not enough, but we need to know what happens when the constraint is non-negotiable. So she's implying that we know how they negotiate constraints, but we don't know what happens when that constraint is not negotiable. So there's kind of a gap, a theoretical gap in the literature there. And towards the end of the paragraph, she concludes that an investigation into the relationship between recreation specialization, constraints, and FOMO-induced regret deserves further academic attention. So in this paragraph, the focus is very much on the theoretical problem, on the academic problem, and the student explains why there is a problem and why we need to research it very well. If you are enjoying the video, please press the like button, and if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many other tips and tools about how to write your introduction in the Virtual Tutor video book, including more examples of the various boundaries and relevance. And if you want to know more about the video book, the link is in the description below. Time to move on to the practical rationale. The practical rationale refers to the relevance of the study for individuals, organizations, or even society. This is related to the context pillar. There must be reasons, practical reasons, industry reasons, societal reasons for the research to be carried out, and therefore you are expected to explain what those reasons are. An example of a well-explained practical rationale comes from the dissertation entitled An Adaptive Model of Trust Development Practices in Corporate Client Event Agency Relationships. The student starts by bringing in a number of facts about how the industry works, and then concludes with an observation of how beneficial to the industry would be if we were to understand more how trust is developed when developing relationships between the corporate client and the event agency. So again, a good argument is made for the practical relevance of studying the topic, in this instance, how trust is developed between these two parties, corporate client and event agency. A final method of explaining the relevance of the research is the personal relevance. This is not always used because sometimes there's no particular personal relevance, and usually it's an add-on, whereas the theoretical relevance and the practical relevance are compulsory. They need to be there. The personal relevance is optional. When explaining the personal relevance of the topic area, you may do so by explaining that you have an interest in a particular area of marketing or management, for example. It may be that you have an interest in a specific societal problem and you explain why you have that particular interest. And sometimes students explain why they are focusing on that topic based on their future career plans. I've had students in the past explaining that they want to focus on that topic because they think it will be useful for the career they expect to embrace once they graduate. Here are two brief examples. The first one comes from the dissertation entitled An Exploration of the Personality Traits Exerted by the Corporate Events Salesperson Across the Stages of the Sales Process. And the student included this statement, which is the author was motivated to explore the personality traits following success in a corporate event sales role, where the personality traits exerted by the sales team appear to be consistent. So the reasons why she wanted to focus on personality traits was because she noticed that there was a relevance during her placement, and then she was curious about it and wanted to explore it further. The second example comes from the dissertation on trust development practices in corporate client event agency relationships. And the student added the statement that the context was chosen due to her previous experience with the corporate events agency and insights that she gained from the rapport developed with clients to ultimately develop the relationship between the two parties. This is never an extensive part of the introduction, but you may want to include brief references to the personal relevance if that's relevant to you. Hopefully you will now understand the ingredients of a dissertation, which are closely tied to its purpose, where we have both boundaries and relevance, and boundaries are theoretical and context boundaries, and relevance includes theoretical or academic reference, practical or industry relevance, and personal relevance. If you aren't sure what is meant by process, content, and context, which is vital when you're writing your dissertation, I've got a video that explains these three elements of the research, which I call the 3 pillars of research. You can click on this link to watch the video. That's all for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you at the next video.